Okay, here we are, micro lesson number 2. This is continuing variation in calls. Frequency shifts part 2. Some variation in recorded frequencies of vocal signatures depends on physics of sound, such as what we covered last micro lesson, the Doppler shift. There are still many other variations that we'll cover, but today the topic is jamming avoidance response, JAR. What is jamming avoidance response? How does this impact the calls we see and are trying to identify? So let's do a hypothetical of two bats flying in the same space, the same species, pretty much looking for the same prey. What happens when the echoes you hear are not from your own calls? So we've got the two bats echoing at 72 kilohertz or calling at 72 kilohertz, and they're expecting to hear the echoes back at 72 kilohertz. However, since they're both at the same frequency, they can hear each other's echoes because they're anticipating or tuned to those frequencies. So which prey item do they go after? It can be a bit confusing. You may have had a similar experience with your car radio when you're driving, excuse me, and reach the edge of the reception for a station's signal, and then it overlaps with another station. In radio parlance, this is called adjacent channel interference. You're receiving the sounds of two stations simultaneously, and it's very difficult to make out either one. To avoid jamming each other's signals and returning echoes, the individuals of the same species will shift calling frequencies up or down. So here, our same two guys are flying. The one remains at the original frequency 72, and the other one on the bottom has dropped his calling frequency to 68. Now they're hearing their returning echoes of their own frequencies, and they are not confused or confounded. An example of a recorded file when another individual comes in and arrives at the foraging site. The first bat usually remains at the same frequency, and the newly arrived bat usually shifts its frequency lower to prevent jamming the other. Groups of individuals tend to forage in the same space and time, as well as frequently mixed species aggregations when resources are abundant. I have most commonly recorded jamming avoidance response among species of the mustache bats, Pteronodus, but it's not limited to these. Here's an example recording. The original, here in green on the left, is calling roughly around 72 kilohertz. The individual of the same species arrives on the right and drops its calls down to around 68. So it shifted its calls and they're avoiding jamming each other. Here you can see where the second bat had a single pulse at a lower frequency, just, I guess, testing to see how much he needed to shift it down. This is just a little bit above the 70 kilohertz, and then as he continued, it dropped. And you can actually see there's a pulse here, a fragment of a pulse that's even a bit lower. A few more examples from the same Pteronodus fulvus for northern Central America. It used to be called Pteronodus davii. Here you can see one with the lower frequency, but you can see calls interspersed of the higher frequency bat. So we have two individuals of the same species shifted their frequencies. Another very clear example, here the shift wasn't quite as much, and here we have the same thing again. It's not limited to the Pteronodus. And also I should point out, If a third individual arrives in the same area, it will typically shift its frequency above the other two. So if the original was calling at 72, the second bat down at 68, this one may raise up to 74. Here's a couple other examples. Here's Myotis elegans, a Vespertilionid. The standard diagnostic frequency here, and the second bat came in and shifted its frequency up just a little bit to avoid jamming. The Embellonurid Centronictrus centralis, here we have also frequency shifts, so it's not limited to the Mormoapids. As you review your call data and see similar looking calls separated by 2 to 3 kilohertz, beware of the possibility of jamming avoidance response. Is this separation consistent or is it transient? These are not separate species or different species. Keep that in mind. Aside from those, I have been teaching workshops on awareness of jamming avoidance response is not generally included in bat acoustic workshops. There's a fair amount of literature on this topic. If anybody's interested in a complete bibliography from my library, you can email me. But originally, a lot of this jamming avoidance response work was on electric fishes, the electric eels sending out their electrical signals. And there's a lot of literature now on jamming bat calls by moths to avoid bats, and a whole host of literature on just individuals avoiding jamming each other. So, more micro lessons for microbats will follow. Click the subscribe button to be notified when the next lesson is available. And until then, let's all continue to agree with the rodents. We need to save the angels. Look, angels. And by listening carefully, we'll know who they are. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.